I think everyone knows that the second Tuesday in May is colloquially referred to as Nerd Christmas because of the budget, and it is always deeply interesting to see where the government is putting the money and are they putting their money where their mouth is. And here to talk about the gender lens on the budget and the gender focus of budget is an incredible panel, and I'm here to introduce Sally Moyle. Sally is a feminist icon, and she has been in numerous human rights and gender equality leadership roles, including she is an honorary associate professor at the ANU, associated with the Gender Institute, and she has had extensive experience in international development policy and practice and almost 20 years of experience of addressing gender issues both domestically and in international development.
Thanks. Yeah, hi everybody. This is the last panel before the end of this afternoon, so thank you for your perseverance and your patience. I think this is a fabulous panel that I'll be emceeing this afternoon to talk about gender responsive government systems and budgeting. It sounds dry. And it is a bit dry, but I think we have to recognise that gender equality is as much about how we do stuff as what we do, right? And so process is absolutely central to gender equality outcomes. And having worked within institutions and across government over the last, 30 odd years now, it really has come home to me how important it is that we get the processes right, the accountabilities and the incentives, and that they're all aligned to keep people's feet to the fire and keep them moving along. So this is the conversation about how we do that process in this panel, and I'm really pleased to be able to introduce all of our glittering stars across this panel. Dr. Helen Hodgson is a professor from Curtin University, and she's my colleague on the National Foundation for Australian Women. She's the chair of the Social Policy Committee. You can see her, all of the CVs in your pack, but that is an introduction to Helen. We've got Niki Vincent, who's the Commissioner for Gender Equality in Victoria, in the Victorian public sector, and she's the inaugural commissioner in that role, implementing the whole of government leadership on gender equality, for which Victoria has become well known. Tanja at Kovac is one of the principals of Gender Lens Australia and one of my colleagues on the shift, and she's made a significant contribution to delivering the outcomes that we're seeing now in Victoria through her work in Gen Vic. And finally, we have Dr. Ramona Vijeyarasa from UTS in Sydney, who has done some fabulous work both domestically and internationally on gender equality outcomes, and is the author and the founder of the Gender Legislation Index that we will be hearing about this afternoon. So our speakers are really well qualified to talk about how we do the gender equality work that we're seeking to achieve. And I've just have to say, thank you so much to all of our earlier speakers for setting the context for us in terms of what we're seeking to achieve. Here now we're talking about how we create institutions that can deliver on those outcomes. So I would first, before we start, like to also pay my respects to the traditional owners of the lands on which we're meeting, and also pay respects to the custodians of the land on which I normally live, the Narragaow people outside of Canberra. I'd like to start first of all then by asking each of our panellists, why do you think gender equality, gender responsive budgeting is important? Give us your ideas about what it is and why it's important. And I think Helen's going to start us off with a really interesting case study.
Okay, thank you for that, Sally. And I'd like to acknowledge that I come from the lands of the Whadjuk people in Perth, and pay my respects to the traditional owners here as well. So people say, why does a boring tax accountant end up talking about feminist policy? My background is that I had one of those sliding door moments that was mentioned earlier. I spent a term in the West Australian Legislative Council. Now, another question for the audience, see if you're awake. How many of you remember the Australian Democrats? Oh, there's a few. Excellent, yeah. So I was a member of the Legislative Council when the Australian Democrats were in Parliament, and that taught me how much policy affects people's lives. And policy often comes back to financial foundations, unfortunately, and we heard a bit about that earlier. So my expertise, my technical expertise, is in tax and superannuation. and my PhD touched on family tax benefits, which brought me into the feminist policy space. And that leads me to a position where I am totally obsessed, I suppose, by developing women's economic empowerment. And that means looking at financial systems and structures and making sure that they recognise the differences in women's lives. So the case study that I was going to raise relates to our superannuation system. Now, we all know about the superannuation gap, the gap that emerges when women retire compared to when men retire. In a lot of ways, our superannuation system is a policy success. However, it was built by the male patriarchy. It was built on a foundation of male breadwinner employment paradigms. And from the very start, there were feminist authors like Rhonda Sharp who highlighted that this did not work in favour of women. So what do we do to make it more friendly? And I will start by stating the obvious. We must have secure safety nets. I'm not going to go down the pathway of arguing for or against universal basic income and all the rest of it, but that secure safety net has to be there for people who don't have any other form of support. But just looking at the superannuation system, what do we do? Do we start to increase the superannuation schedules for women compared to men? What are the consequences of that? How does that affect women's employment? Does it make them more expensive for an employer to employ women than if they were to employ a man? Or does it come out of their salary by giving women a lower take-home pay? So where do we start with these solutions? And ultimately what it comes down to is our gendered workforce systems. We've got problems in the way that the workforce system is constructed, and I know that there is work being done in that space at the moment. But as long as we have a gender pay gap, we will continue to have a problem with superannuation because it's based on our pay. So the starting point isn't superannuation. The starting point has to be women's employment concerns and how that works. And this is where gender-responsive budgeting comes in. Because you talk to people who don't understand the interconnectivity of the different systems, and they'll say, oh, we should just pay more superannuation for women. But that has a whole range of other policy flow-on connections that are problematic. And this is why we have to have an overarching gendered analysis of all policies that come through our parliaments. We focus on federal, but also on state parliaments. And we need to make sure that they are analysed in a holistic way, not just from the perspective of the person who's putting this, or the department that's putting this policy together, because they don't know the answers to everything. And we need to have this holistic, interconnected analysis going on continuously to make sure that policies that are designed take into account the different circumstances that women face compared to men when these policies are set up.
Thanks, Helen. And I think that just demonstrates that where you start is where you end up, right? If you follow the string along, once you get beyond the workplace stuff as well, you end up with gender norms and how people decide what they're going to do with their lives. It takes us much more broadly. Niki, can you tell us why you think it's important?
Yeah, and for exactly the same reasons. I was actually talking at a Women in Super event last week, and all of that came up. And there is just system after system and countless example after example of how government systems, budgeting, programs, policies, services, and products outside of government have been designed without considering gender, and therefore have been designed for a kind of default male. I'm sure there are loads of people in this room who've read Caroline Criado Perez's book Invisible Women. Put your hand up if you... Yeah, there are quite a lot, but if you haven't, then I do thoroughly recommend it, because if you need any evidence for why we should have a gender lens, she provides in that incredibly well-researched international bestseller countless example after example after example. And I think to to add to what you said as well, the people, and we were just talking about this at the tea break, the people that are putting these lenses over policies, programs, services, budgets, etc., are not necessarily feminists, but they suddenly get to see how unequal the world is. People who are deniers of the reason potentially to put a gender lens when they're forced to, as they are in Victoria now because of the legislation that we have, one part of which I administer, then suddenly get it. So it's sort of like a Trojan horse or a secret weapon that we're deploying into organisations to make them bring other perspectives, intersectional gender perspectives into their policy making and their program design, their service design and their budgeting. And to see in Victoria our Department of Finance taking this on has been really exciting, and see them, get into the nitty gritty of budgeting around this in really gendered way, bringing gendered lenses to it has been really exciting, I have to say. Seems like the last bastion of kind of where we need it to get to in terms of thinking differently about how we approach these things.
Thank you. I think it's fabulous to think of gender responsive budgeting as a Trojan horse for feminism, to grow generations of new people with their gender spectacles firmly on their faces. It's great. And just to one small anecdote, if I might, I read this morning on Twitter that we never realised that female songbirds have unique songs that they sing because we never had female scientists willing to research the female songbirds. And so it's as esoteric as songbird songs that the gender lens brings us to. Tan.
Hi everybody, I'm Tanja Kovac and I'm looking down here and up here on the names, and I feel like I should have my colleague Dr. Marie Overall with me. I'm dragging the change. You and me, Sally, we're dragging the change on the doctor front. I'm here today. I'm a she-they, a political they. The feminist in me from university days would have been very excited to see that where we are in being able to choose pronouns that have no gender. So I'm very pleased to be able to say that. Marie and I established Gender Lens Australia as a social impact consultancy to help private sector, government and community organisations to transform for gender equality. And we're able to support Dr. Vincent's work with the Commission, because there are now 300 organisations in Victoria that must through legislation transform. But it's not just the government sector. We're supporting sporting associations, we're supporting law firms, we work with local councils, we work with schools, and the transformation project is huge. We started our work though in government and at the partnership of developing a gender equality strategy in Victoria included foundational reforms, including a Gender Equality Act, gender responsive budgeting, and the setting of gendered targets. That framework of a gender responsive government system was only made possible through the relationship between the community sector, the executive being politicians, and in particular a critical mass of women politicians prepared, and I would say feminist politicians prepared to champion that cause in difficult circumstances in Cabinet and in Parliament, and also the government and strong feminists within the bureaucracy. And it's that partnership and a partnership with the private sector that is going to keep driving a gender responsive system. We never imagined we would, Sal. We never imagined we would, but Marie and I have totally become feminists focused on funds, Some of you, we didn't have enough today, but you've got more people than we expected, Helen, which is a great place to be. Some of you will have a piece of paper that we've provided to you of our analysis of the share of the budget. So this year we released a Gender Budget Watch, which is applying a gendered lens on the federal budget, but also looking across the whole country at various states and territories, and the amount of dedicated investment into gender equality, women, and primary and secondary violence and tertiary violence. It's just not enough. And our focus with Gender Budget Watch is to increase accountability and to see the community sector working with government to keep that accountability. You'll also see on the other side that for the last 25 years we've been also tracking dedicated gender equality spend in Victoria. We'd love to get to this granular level across the whole of the country. Because you can see, for whatever reason, treasuries have been believing that the envelope for this kind of work, for the work that we all do, the work that we care about, Treasury has consistently seen the envelope being around $4 million. And if you took that in Victoria, just divided that by all of the organisations that are just members of the statewide peak body, GenVic, that's less than a person. And we've got this same problem at every level. And so Niki's work is incredibly important. We'd really love, a big reason we established Gender Lens Australia is to help the rest of the country. We were privileged to be able to do that in government, to have feminists in the bureaucracy, but we're really interested in being able to take what the Victorian experience and see it translated across the country.
Thanks, Tan. Ramona, why do you think it's important?
Thank you, and thanks for having me here. So I come to this conversation as a lawyer and do a lot of work around gender responsive lawmaking, and have been privileged to have some conversations in the last couple of years with people around why gender responsive lawmaking and budgeting are actually intersecting concepts, which I'll come to later. But why do I think gender responsive budgeting matters? I'll pick up on Tanya's point, which I think is about why it's important to put a number on things. So I was very recently lucky to come across this book. I don't read in French, but it's a French author who to me is the French male version of Carolina Criado, the author of Invisible Woman. And he's a French geographer named Yves Rabot. And he wrote this book, The City is Made by and for Men. Mm-hmm. And so in his study, he studied Bordeaux in particular, but he started studying cities. And what he came across in these cities across Bordeaux was the fact that the government was subsidising sports activities for young people in the city, but that the majority of beneficiaries were boys. In fact, the number of beneficiaries who were women were half that of the number of boys. Skates parks were sort of 95% boys, and he started to ask why. So he obviously had to put a number on things. And when he looked into it, he found that certain sports, such as dancing and horse riding, were considered private activities. They weren't subsidised. In fact, some of them actually attracted a VAT, a value-added tax. Rugby and football were free. And so he partnered with the Mayor of Bordeaux to rethink about how the subsidies would work, and over about a 9-year period changed the beneficiaries from 80% boys to 52% female, which I think is a remarkable turnaround in that period of time. And I suppose why I really like this story, one, we've got a male working to bring the feminist lens, because it can't be all the work sitting on women's shoulders. But why I like it is, first of all, I think it reminded me that we already have inequality in our society, and if we don't talk about those inequalities, our budgets and our laws will just paper over it. There are a lot of reasons why girls, especially young adolescents, don't occupy public spaces, around safety and attitudes about where women and girls should be. And so bringing a gender lens to our budgets and laws can actually help us to shift that underlying inequality. I also like this example because it shows how tangible gender responsive budgeting can be. I work on a lot of areas of women's rights, and I think it's sometimes really hard to show a correlation between what we do and the impact. Whereas when it comes to gender responsive budgeting, it's really clear to see the impact. I also came across recently this act in South Korea, which is a Public Toilets Act, where they're trying to improve sanitation for South Koreans. And what they did in bringing a gender lens, they decided the number of cubicles for females in public toilets had to be the same or more than the number for men. Now, for anyone who's lined up at a toilet, we would know why this has to happen, but I think that's remarkable that a gender lens actually enables someone to think, yes, we need to design policy and the financing of this act differently than without the gender lens. So you can see the impact. And the third reason why I like this story from this French geographer is, to me, it shows that gender-responsive budgeting is relevant across everything. Every age group, every socio-economic group benefits, every financial issue and activity. It's really that cross-cutting lens that's benefiting regardless of your circumstance. So that's why it's such an important tool in our toolkit.
Thank you. I think that's exactly right. Gender is about everything, and everything's about gender. You know, once you find the people, you find the gender issues, and then you need to start, disaggregating it. So, interestingly, Australia was the first country in the world to implement gender-responsive budgeting, and it was a real step forward for us back in the 80s. We forgot about it for quite some time, and now we're reinventing ourselves again. So I'm wondering if I can ask Helen to take us through the recent, whatever history you'd like to give us, but particularly I'm thinking of the recent history about gender-responsive budgeting in Australia and NFAW's position in it.
Okay, so I'd like people to think back to 2014, when Tony Abbott was the Minister for Women. and he decided that we had already achieved parity and therefore we didn't need gender-responsive budgeting in the government budget papers anymore. Now, that was the impetus for our project, but I'd like to go back even further than that, because as Sally has said, we were the first country to institute gender-responsive budgeting, but progressively, and this was across both colours of government, Coalition and Labor, progressively the effect of that was reduced until by the late 90s, 2000s, what we were getting were statements of, good news stories, glossies.
Once
stories,
it was a postcard.
Yeah, well,
1 year.
yeah, they were just the stories of the things where we have initiated this program specifically for women, and this is what it's going to do, without any in-depth analysis and without actually looking at the overall overarching effects across all portfolios. Because this is the thing that I said earlier, you've got to look at it in a holistic way. So in 2014, Mari Coleman said, right, we're going to do something about this. And so the NFAW started its Gender Lens project. It started with just a few portfolios by dedicated people who were already around. And since then, it has been become an annual project. It's grown from strength to strength. And I'd like to give a shout out to the people that I have met in person today who have contributed to our Gender Lens over the years, one or more times, whom I may have met over Zoom and plenty of emails, but it's so nice to see everybody gathered in the same place for a change. So our project, we basically try to cover as many portfolios as we can. But there's a big rider on that in that we are voluntary. We don't have funding. We do it out of our sense of responsibility to the feminist movement and to the people of Australia. And that means that sometimes your pet portfolio might not get a mention in our analysis simply because we don't have the right person available to do the project. Remembering, we do it in 10 days. We go to budget lock-up. We meet as a team of drafters, and our goal is always to get the analysis out to ahead of Senate estimates so that senators with an interest in feminism and in measuring outcomes have our product to be able to use and to direct them in certain channels. Unfortunately, that's at the time that so many other people are looking at the effect that the budget's having on their own organisations. So we acknowledge that. But some of you will find some LinkedIn invitations from me based on what I'm hearing people say today. So where do we fit into the process? Now, I'm going to bring a slightly academic lens here in that both the OECD and the IMF World Bank have frameworks around how to do gender-responsive budgeting. They sort of targeted the developing nations, and in fact the World Bank has a policy Sally would probably know more about this than I do, but in order to qualify for certain types of funding, you have to be able to show that you are implementing a gender-responsive framework. Now, one of the steps in that, it starts pre-budget, it starts at getting the information together, it looks at how the policies are formed, but there is always an ex post ante analysis of the effects and the outcomes of the process, and that's where we fit in. When you look at how that's done, it can be done internally. You can have Treasury doing it, and that's great, but it's unlikely to be released into the public space if there's any bad news coming out of that. You can also have civil society involvement in that. The Women's Budget Group in the UK is probably the best known example, and it's what we've modelled our work on. And we basically make our product available to any organisations. You know, it's on the internet. Anybody who knows about it can look it up and use it in their own work. So that's our project, that's the motivation for it, and it's not something that it's going to go away just because the current government says that it has a commitment to gender-responsive budgeting. We're there to, I'm going to use my old catchphrase, keep them honest. We're there to say, well, you're saying that you're implementing these processes, but where's the evidence that you are implementing them?
Thank you. I think there's a few ingredients around gender-responsive budgeting and capacity leadership, capacity development, incentives and accountability, and the NFAW is keeping the accountability piece in place, so external accountability. I might skip over Niki and ask Tanja. You've been involved in advocating for gender-responsive budgeting for quite some time, particularly in the Victorian context. Can you tell us about the process for getting the Victorian government to take this seriously?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, it really did start with, I would say it starts with committed women representatives. Yeah. So a big piece of the work that Marie and I have done over the last 20 years has been ensuring that there is a critical mass of progressive, pro-choice women in Parliament. And if it wasn't for that, you wouldn't have the drive and the change for within government at all, because you couldn't carry it through Cabinet and you couldn't get it passed in Parliament. Because that existed, because there was a cabinet that was almost gender equal, it certainly is gender equal today in Victoria, because we did have that, we were able to pass a gender equality strategy. It was the first gender equality strategy in Victoria, and I can tell you behind the scenes, if it was not for women cabinet ministers, that policy would not have passed, even in the cabinet. So it's really critically important to have those people making the decisions. That strategy sent some foundational reforms. One of them was GRB. And Helen, you know, we went to the United Nations. I went with the late Fiona Richardson. We went to the United Nations and we were horrified to find that Australia had become so bad at GRB, considering where it had been, that we were no longer the leaders, that we were being overtaken by Philippines and most of the Nordic nations. And we were very determined to see that change, which is why that ended up in the strategy. The truth is, though, that actually getting it to be a part of Treasury is not easy. Treasury is not full of feminist economists. It never has been. It has taken a long time. It's actually radical that the IMF and the OECD are now saying that growth is linked to closing the productivity gap, and you need women to be a part of that solution for you. This is huge. It's only relatively recently that the IMF had a woman leader, Christine Lagarde, who decided that it was okay to have targets and quotas. So we actually have to do a lot of work transforming the economists within Treasury to see that this work is not a part of a political cycle that you can chuck out as soon as there's not a progressive government. This is core work of good fiscal management. If you are not providing a gender lens over the top of your budget, you are actually not doing the budget right. Yeah. And this is the point that we now make predominantly with our clients, because the big thing that has happened for us as we've continued to do this work, and Helen has touched on this as well. It's one thing to have policy and bureaucracy commitment to the issue, but if we don't keep championing it, if we don't put forward really great budget bids, really well thought out business cases for the work that we want to do, including making sure that it's not just that the organisations are not providing free accountability analysis. I know Helen and I were having this discussion offline about the benefits of having NFAW do the work unfunded versus having it funded. I'm very much on the side that this kind of work should be funded by government and funded to be fully independent and fierce. But it's fundamental that we have that external review as well taking place.
Thank you. It is true often that gender equality thinking starts from that really instrumental kind of place of gender equality being smart economics, but once you've got your in, you can start building towards that transformative change. And I might ask Ramona to tell us, if you wouldn't mind, about your work with the Gender Legislative Index.
Sure, thanks, Sally. But if I can, I might just come back to this point about how do you create a situation where the government has to fund and do this work. Because it is important to celebrate that Australia started, but as Helen and Tanja have told us, we've now fallen behind. And so shortly after Australia, you actually had the Philippines, who enacted a law requiring gender-responsive budgeting by public agencies, government agencies, from the very beginning. Now, the GRB in the Philippines has been problematic and flawed in various respects, but it's happened every year since the early 1990s, precisely because it is an obligation in law.
And sorry, do you know where that came from? From a CEDAW complaint. There was a complaint under the CEDAW Convention to the committee, and that's what drove the government, that external accountability piece.
And to add to that story, so that it actually came from what was called a Women in Nation Building Act, from an organisation that was focused on women in nation building, who happened to be the wife of a male parliamentarian who helped push that forward too, that kind of collaboration, a feminist saying this is the kind of law we need to get into the books. And what I think is interesting when you look at the history of GRB, Australia and South Africa were early to the table, but South Africa has also been quite late to legislate, in 2019 or so. But I could name around 30 countries around the world right now, all of which require gender-responsive budgeting, funded work done by the public sector in a law. And, I think that's why it's so great that Victoria set a model now for us to think about emulating across states and federally. So this is where I think there's a really nice link between the law's role in institutionalising the practice of GRB so that it's not done by the not-for-profit sector for free in a way that's not sustainable and shouldn't be our work. We can then mirror or shadow what the government's doing, but the government should be doing this work. But in answer to your question about the Gender Legislative Index, the Gender Legislative Index is a tool I created about 5 years ago at the University of Technology, Sydney, to ask questions about how we make laws and do laws actually make women's lives better. Because so often we enact one law that governs the lives of everybody without taking into account the fact that different people of different genders are obviously going to experience that law differently. So how do you make sure there's that gender check? In law, you have something called legislative scrutiny, but if there's no gender legislative scrutiny, it's a huge accountability step that's missing. So the Gender Legislative Index is actually based on CEDAW. I'm a big believer in the convention as an accountability tool and a structure, and it offers 7 criteria for lawmakers to ask when enacting a law. Questions like, does this law guarantee access to affordable and accessible services? Whether that's free childcare or access to safe and legal abortion. Does this law actively promote equality between people of different genders? Does this law prevent forced coercion in decision making? Does this law guarantee access to redress when the law goes wrong? So the criteria are all there. It's a public tool. I've got some flyers if anyone wants to look at it. But the reason why I think it's a really important one, it's a call to bring a gender perspective across all areas of legislation, not just areas that are earmarked as women's issues or women's concerns. So not just GBV and reproductive health, which are all fundamental, but how do you bring a gender lens to the regulation of artificial intelligence, corruption law, banking, finance, across the board? How do you bring this gender perspective? And the second thing that I think is really fundamental, it's calling out laws that are often drafted as if they're gender neutral, which we still continue to do. So, we have a Workplace Safety Act in Australia from 2012, which is treated as gender neutral. It cares more about whether there's a spillage on a factory floor and the risk for workplace health and safety. There is nothing in there on sexual harassment, which is addressed somewhere else. So you've got this gender neutral law, which is clearly not governing a gender neutral issue. And so that's why we need to bring this gender lens to budgets, but also to law.
Thank you. Tan?
I think we're just reflecting on it. We need to call out a little bit the program of gender mainstreaming here, because there's a lot of talk about us doing this in government, but it's not actually happening.
Lack of accountability, right?
And this is a prime example. There should be somewhere in government that is drawing attention to the challenge of these individual pieces of legislation and pulling that out. Niki's not funded to be able to do that kind of work. The remit of that legislation does not enable her to do that work. But it's absolutely critical that we start to do that.
And, Office for Women, when I was a leader in Office for Women, Senate estimates would ask us about anything. What's the gender implications of what's happening in the wilds of the health department? And I'd go, well, I'm not a shadow government, we do what we do. You should ask health. They should know. But this brings us to Niki's position and the culmination of a lot of work across a lot of frames that does give us a really strong legislative and procedural framework for gender responsive budgeting and gender responsive government systems. Tell us about that, Niki.
Yeah, so as Tanja said, it's the work of so many groups outside of government, but also, as you said, feminist politicians, and that's why it's so important to have them in Parliament, have that representation. Unions, women's health organisations, Gen Vic, really strong advocacy, a bunch of really amazing academic lawyers, and you can literally see their submissions written into the legislation. It's powerful. It's one of the things that I was amazed about when I looked at the legislation when I was applying for the role, and it's an incredible privilege to be enacting or operationalising this legislation now in Victoria. It is incredibly comprehensive. It's only covering the public sector, about 304 organisations, but it also not just your regular public sector, but all local government and all 9 universities in Victoria are covered by the legislation. And they have a bunch of obligations. So the first one is a general duty to promote gender equality, but then some really specific kind of areas which require some work. They are to audit their workplace across 7 key gender equality indicators every 2 years. So gender pay gaps, gender composition at all levels, gender composition of the governing body, sexual harassment, reports of sexual harassment, and the anonymously reported experience of sexual harassment as well. Flexible work and other forms of flexibility, recruitment and promotion practices, carers leave and so forth. And gendered segregation within their workforces as well. They send all of that data. We've done this twice now, so I can tell you that it's 67 million data points from them each time. So we have a lot of data. We got the first data in 2021. The legislation came into effect in 2021, in March 2021. And then they take that data, and the first year, it operates on a 4-year cycle. First year, they collect the data, they analyse it, they then look at where they find inequalities in their workplace, and they develop a gender equality action plan to address any inequality. And they do that plan in consultation with their governing body, with their employees, and with any employee representatives in their organisations as well. And that consultation process is mandated in the legislation. They submit that plan and all of their data to me, and then they have to publish it on their own websites, and I publish it on our website. So you can go and have a look at every single organisation covered by the legislation, and look on our website, and you will find their summary data and their gender equality action plan. And later this year, you'll be able to see their progress data that came in February, so how much progress they've made on each of those indicators. And you'll be able to find their progress report, so how they justify the progress that they've made. Now, all of that sounds really fantastic. We're still working it out. It's still pretty messy, I would have to say. There's some bugs in the system that we need to get out, and we'll get better at this over time. And plus, we are 19.7 FTE, including me, so that's a lot of work for a small team of people. The other thing that they must make reasonable and material progress on those indicators every 2 years. So that's a big commitment, that's a big responsibility as well. Most of them, I will tell you, inside GOS, haven't made a lot of progress on that yet. But we are seeing real green shoots in what, a lot of them weren't even collecting the data that they needed to give us the first time around, and now we're seeing that starting to come to fruition. So we'll have better data from the very, early stages. The other thing that they have to do is put a gender lens over every policy, program or service that has a direct and significant impact on the public. And you think about these organisations, most of what they do has a direct and significant impact on the public. So that's huge as well. Now, that's not being done very well by most organisations. Some are doing brilliantly. Most don't really get it. And when we say gender lens, and then we ask, the Act asks that we also, that they also consider an intersectional lens, an intersectional gender lens as well. What we're mostly getting is those lenses put on separately instead of from a truly sort of intersectional effect. So we've got lots of education to do, lots of work to do, but we have made a really good start. Now, further down the track, the legislation also gives me power to set targets and quotas, and we will do that. I will do that to drive change where I don't think that's happening quickly enough. I also have powers to settle disputes of systemic gender inequality in individual organisations where inequality is affecting a class or group of people. And we also have, the Minister has power under the legislation to set procurement guidelines as well. So there's lots of levers that we've got there. We also now in Victoria have gender responsive budgeting as well. So you would think that that gender impact assessment, where it has a direct and significant impact on the public, would pick up budgets as well, and it does, but the government wanted to be even surer that this was made clear, particularly to the public service, and so set up a gender responsive budgeting unit in Treasury and Finance. They have worked using the same materials that we have for gender impact assessments to design materials to do gender sensitive budgeting, and we work together, and that's now been put into the Financial Management Act this year. That came into effect. So we've got the legislation, and we've made a really good start, and we're seeing some really great green shoots here in Victoria.
Thank you. And I think we have to recognise that Victoria is leading the way, right? But we're seeing other jurisdictions following suit. We've got the federal government, of course, with its new gender equality strategy and the including gender guidelines, which I think are really good and are leading change. Very baby steps from the federal government, though. And, we're seeing New South Wales, Western Australia, there's green shoots happening. Not so much Western Australia.
Being from Western Australia, I would say that they are very, very microscopic.
Tiny baby steps.
Shoots. I have seen a report that was, it's on the website, so I can reference it, but Treasury does have a unit that's working with the other states on the federal, the gender processes across the Commonwealth. The title's this long, but the Commonwealth state initiatives. There's a report that is on Treasury's website about care sector. But I would just say, first of all, I'm going to give a shout out to ERA here, because when Sally said that so many, minister would say, give us some information about whatever. My understanding is that over the last few years, they've gone to ERA and they've said, ERA, have you got some information about this, please? So a shout out to ERA and to all of the organisations who've responded when Helen or Madeline or her predecessors have got in touch and said, we need something on this fairly urgently. The other thing I would say is that the processes for gender budgeting do seem to be starting to show effect. The first thing is that it's in Hansard, so I think I can say this, is that the changes to the stage 3 tax cuts were largely decided after looking at the gender effects that would flow through from those stage 3 tax cuts. Now, this is something that we pointed out in our NFAW report when they were first announced. However, it did finally have some effect. And there was a comment earlier about the Future Made in Australia project and how blokey that is. There is one small recognition in there. There is an employment project which does reference the need to put some money towards developing skills for women to be working in that project, but it's very vague at this point. The colleagues at WAVE, I think, said that the more detailed briefing that they had was that it didn't look too bad. But having said that, the steps are there. It's just the culture has to be changed, and the best way to change culture is to make them do it.
Yeah. Accountability, incentives, leadership and capacity development, I think, are the 4 steps that are needed.
But it's also important about what type of GRB it is.
Yeah.
Because there are different types.
Well, that does take us to our next question, and that is, so what next? Where to from here? We've got some early steps in the Australians field. Where to next, and what can civil society do to keep holding governments to account? We might start with you, Tan, from that point of view.
I'll go back to what I was just about to say. There are 3 types really of GRB. There is gender responsive budgeting, which is looking at what you've just done. It's a hindsight analysis, and largely that is what governments have been doing.
Yeah.
So they're not engaged really in using gender to shape their decision making. That is what the new legislation in Victoria, and no doubt what the legislation that Ramona was talking about internationally, is trying to do. It is to skill the bureaucracy, to skill Treasury and other parts of the departments to put the gender lens on before you even get there, so that the investments start to change, so that I'm not producing analysis that says there's not enough going to women and girls and non-binary people. So we've got to get to that second stage, and I think that's the evolution that we're on. What Helen was talking about is this third stage, which is where you start to use the budget to fundamentally transform the economy, to use the fiscal levers, and we are evolving that now. This is because we've got more feminist economists in the right places of the institutions. What do we need to do? What would I like to see happen? I want to see the gender equality sector, the women's sector, the family violence and gendered violence sectors get much better at doing their budget bids to government, of framing their business cases. And if I could lend one thing to this conference today, it is to get an understanding about the process that happens in government every year about the cycle. There is a cycle. And big businesses know this cycle. They understand it, they bid, and that's what you're competing against. And the role that we are having at Gender Lens Australia is to help demystify that for the sector and build bigger budgets for women and gender equality. So we'd love to see more knowledge about that, empowerment, and that's what our training and also our work is devoted to.
Thank you. I might go to you next, Ramona.
Sure. So what would I like to see? Well, I'll actually start with a development that came out of Tasmania, since we're talking about institutionalising these processes. So some of you might know the work of an independent MP there. I know it's a small state that we often overlook. Her name's Ruth Forrest. And she came across the Gender Legislative Index, and she put forward a motion in Tasmanian Parliament to create a Gender and Equality Audit Committee to actually audit legislation. And the motion was successful. So now Tasmania has the only parliamentary committee in any state, territory or federally that's exclusively auditing for gender. ACT has an economy and economic equality one, but now Tasmania has the only one auditing for gender. So if we have a minute, I was invited to one of their hearings to help them audit their first bill. The bill was an instrument that was meant to govern how local councillors, local government officials behave. And without any context, when I went to give them a training, I said, look, I'm imagining you have some issues of sexual harassment, perhaps by a local councillor against another councillor or a local councillor against a local community member. This is what a gender lens to your bill would look like, because it's missing entirely. And of course that started a huge conversation because sexual harassment is an issue, there's many cases, and the Code of Conduct Bill for government officials doesn't deal with that at all, despite being such an obvious issue. What we also realise in that moment, however, is how complex it is, how much time you need to bring a gender lens to law, how much skill you need. So I think it's a watch this space. I don't know if Tasmania will succeed. I'm not necessarily saying every state should copy. We need to be careful in designing structures in institutions that work, so we don't have a tick box exercise and we think gender auditing is happening when it's not actually auditing. But I'm excited to see Tasmania lead. I'm excited to see what that can mean, and I think it's important for other states to think about what tools do you have in your state parliaments to actually audit legislation in this way. And what can civil society do about this? I think it's really interesting that Niki talked about how influential the parliamentary submissions were in feeding into the bill. I'm sure many people in this room have contributed to a parliamentary submission, and we often wonder what happens to them. So very recently I made a submission as part of UTS for the review of the Modern Slavery Act. And the review, I called for a gender lens to how we regulate modern slavery, because obviously the way in which people experience exploitation in supply chains will differ based on gender. In a footnote, it said in the final report summarising all the submissions, one submission even suggested we should bring a gender lens to modern slavery. And I thought, I wonder how many of us would have had to make that submission for them to actually take it seriously. And I came late today because I'm actually at a conference at another law school for international law, and I walked into this space just at the end of the last session, which was the fabulous session with those young women advocates, and this space is warm and diverse, and I walked in and thought, wow, this is an incredible space of solidarity. So you have the platforms to lend support to each other's agendas. So it's not just one person making the call, but it's many, enough so that we'll be heard. So I think what you need is civil society. You have in this room, you have the solidarity and you have the commitment to lend support to each other, to actually not just be one voice, but enough so that we'll be heard.
Thanks, Ramona. Niki, what are your thoughts? Where to next?
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously the Victorian case study of civil society getting together, I think, is a really powerful one. Most governments don't like to be told about Victoria and what Victoria's doing, I discovered. Yeah. But you can always use New Zealand as a case study because they're doing really good work, and that might even be more upsetting. So I think that's really important, and I think if nothing else, what's happened here in Victoria, take away that message about the power of civil society. I think the other thing and we do need to see legislation like we've got in Victoria all around the country, and I happen to know that South Australia is drafting something where they've just scribbled out Victoria and written South Australia, which all power to them. Why reinvent the wheel? So, you know, I think that will happen, and I was talking to New South Wales recently, and their minister is certainly really interested in what we're doing here. So I think we will start to see that. I think the other thing that's really powerful and important is in our legislation, the transparency. So without that, and it also makes it easier for me to do my job. So when the legislation says that each organisation must publish their own results, their own data, their own progress reports, their own gender equality action plans. But I don't know about you, but if you happen to want to find out, you have to go hunt down each of those organisations and find it in some obscure place on their website. And many of them haven't actually published it. But it says in the legislation, the Commissioner may publish, and so I just said, let me just give you a heads up, everyone, I will be publishing. And the moment we pushed the button on releasing that data, within 3 seconds I had journalists, calling me, wanting to know why X organisation has a pay gap of 45%. And my response was, go ask X organisation, because that just puts the work back on them to explain. Their own employees were shocked to find out there was a pay gap of that size. It gives power back to employees, it gives power back to community, it helps the media, helps us do our job by publishing. And if you're in a regional or rural organisation, your local media is going to be wanting to know, because, that's part of what they report on, is what their local council's doing and what their local hospital's doing. So it might not make the ABC, but it might make the local newspaper and put those organisations under pressure. So I think that transparency then also allows, civil society to track it as well.
Thank you. That's great advice. And Helen, what's your thoughts about where to next? What's needed?
Well, I think that we need to really focus, I think, on what the Office for Women's doing next. The input analysis, that's incredibly important. And we do have the directive, we do have the instructions in terms of making budget submissions. But I would encourage anybody who's interested in the history of gender budgeting. There's a very good article by Marion Sora about the history of the Office for Women. And the days, and I've had several glasses of wine with Mari talking about this, Mari Coleman, the days when they had a desk officer. And the desk officer had to sign off on everything that came out of that particular department to say that, yes, it had been properly considered for gender-responsive budgeting. We've got to go past the dollars. We've got to look at the overarching policies, as Ramona says. I mean, I also work a lot with legislation, and gender-neutral language doesn't cut it. There's the economic concepts of equality as well as the legal concepts of neutrality. And we've got to have people there working on the inputs to make sure that everything is properly examined before the policy is developed. And we also need to continue to have the external scrutiny. We need that whole budgeting cycle. We actually need the Australian system to sign up completely to the OECD principles and have the full process, the full cycle actually explored and legislated. Because we don't know. It's still a black box in the budgeting process. Yes, we can put in submissions, but the actual way that they're deliberated on, that's a black box, and we need to have some level of assurance that what happens there properly applies GRB principles.
Thank you. I think, just from my point of view, following and pursuing these really sometimes very dry processes of budgeting and building submissions and doing policy, the aim is that working from within those institutions, we can slowly build that critical mass of thought and critical mass of expertise and critical mass of accountability and incentives to build that tipping point where we do see transformative change. And I have to say, we did do well at that in the 70s and 80s in Australia. And when I came into the public service in the 90s, you could see the residuals of that still, even though governments had lost it. It lasts quite some time. And so I'm really hoping that the impetus that we're seeing now across the states and in the federal government as well, lay that groundwork for that more transformative change down the track again later. But it is up to us to hold them to account, civil society. So with that, I think we've got some time now for some questions and conversation with the audience. If there's some particular questions, I can see, yes.
Thank you for a wonderful discussion. I'm full of questions, but I'll just ask one. I think something similar to what you're describing happened in the ACT a couple of months ago, because there was an article in the Canberra Times which had some shocking headlines about how one company had a 50-something% pay gap for their employees, and so fascinating headline, but to actually work through the information, it actually felt as if the reporter didn't know what the information meant. Right. What does that mean? What are the different? What was the job? What were the different jobs? What were the different hours? Were they hours that were enforced on the individual? Were they hours that she chose? Sorry, I'm making a statement, but I hope it's to invite comment. It feels as if this is only the beginning of the discussion, and certainly the media and the rest of us as well need some education about what to do with the information.
And can I just quickly say, I think that part of the change that we're seeing is that there are some really strong journalists who are providing leadership on gender equality and holding government's feet to the fire on it. And I think that's part of the change. But others will have something to say.
I was just going to say, we haven't touched on the role of Vijeyarasa at all, but they are actually doing some really
Workplace Gender Equality Agency.
Yes. They're actually doing some really good work, and their remit has been widened over the last year or so. So we're going to start seeing some more detailed information coming out. But it's quite true to say that quite often the reporting on the gender pay gap doesn't really understand the difference between the headline figure and the way that relates across pay scales, part-time, full-time, all of those things that we know as women, and it comes through strongly in the work that I do on superannuation. We know as women that the gender pay gap is not just about the dollars you get paid per hour. It's about the number of hours you work. It's about how flexible you are in your working. All of that counts, and we are going to start to see some better quality data. Now we just have to train the journalists to understand it.
Can I just respond a little bit to that issue about the knowledge gap between a person who understands gender equality and sex and gender data disaggregation and someone who doesn't? We are concerned about that. And we think that we're now moving into a space where people are just not going to read 50-page submissions and reports. They're just not. And what is powerful and making an impact is gender data visualisation. So when, and what Vijeyarasa is starting to do well is gender data visualisation. What Niki's data is going to be empowered with, and I know as long as she's got sufficient funding to be able to, there will be gender data visualisations. And you'll see that Gender Lens Australia will not be writing 50-page submissions to get people to understand what percentage of money is going towards the services and the activities that we care about, because we need someone to understand it super quickly.
Don't underestimate the power of a killer statistic.
I think to add to that though, I take heart from, and I've just recently read this incredible Churchill fellowship report that a woman did looking at Iceland and Sweden and London, England or UK and New Zealand in terms of pay equality legislation. And they've, in some of those countries, they've had it in for 20 years or so now. The sophistication, it took time, but the whole community understands the complexities of pay gaps now, and it required, a big injection of funds initially to educate employers and educate the community, but they don't have to do that anymore because most people understand it. So it will happen, and it can happen as fast as we can put funds in to actually create that change.
And just on that, the Philippines example that Ramona pointed us to, for about 15 years, the 5% of the budget that was meant to be devoted to gender equality outcomes was largely devoted to programs, things like ballroom dancing for employees and flower arranging for employees. And it was a joke. It was effectively a joke. It was money down the drain. But they stuck with it, and the capacity development started to kick in, and then you started seeing the Philippines accelerating well beyond Australia in terms of international indices. So we've also got to stick with it, right?
Absolutely.
And I can see we've got some more questions. Sorry.
Thanks, everyone. I'm really appreciative of the length of time and the many shoulders of giants that we're all standing on to have got to this point. But reflecting on some of the earlier conversations today, I guess my question is, I know, Niki, for you, you've managed to kind of try and get the intersectionality lens in to your area, which, I know hasn't quite got as far as you'd like it to as yet. But I guess what I'm wondering is, what are your thoughts about how, as we're pursuing this, we don't end up reinforcing a white middle-class feminist version of gender data? And given we are getting movement starting to get movement at different state and federal levels. How do we actually ensure that we keep that lens? I mean, that was really notable for me when the pay gap data came out earlier this year. We've got women and we've got men. We don't have other genders, and we don't have any reflection on the different intersectionalities and what pay gaps look like for them. So I guess in all of this movement, it would be great to capitalise and not have those other intersectionalities starting back where we were about gender in trying to get this data.
Yeah, and I think I mean, I heard someone say, data is a part of a patriarchy or something along that. But it's actually really powerful. And I think one of the things that we did, an important project that we did using the survey data that we had, where we had people kind of identifying, particular race or LGBTIQ identity, disability, etc. Aboriginality, we were able to, at a rudimentary level, analyse that data for pay gaps. And we put out a report called Intersectionality at Work, which actually showed the pay gaps for people, Aboriginal men, Aboriginal women, non-Aboriginal men, non-Aboriginal women. And the pay gap actually went highest paid non-Aboriginal men, next highest paid Aboriginal men, this is public sector, next highest paid non-Aboriginal women, lowest paid Aboriginal women. And depending on which intersections you were looking at, it kind of went that way. Now, it's a very unsophisticated way of looking at intersectionality, but it had a big impact. It was the first time that people had seen their experience, what they experience, translated into dollar figures, pay gap figures. And I think the more that we can do that, the more people are getting, okay, we can't just ignore it. We might not understand what it is or how to do it, but we need to get better at collecting data so we can start to think about this. It's one answer.
Ramona.
So shortly after Vijeyarasa, the Workplace Gender Equality Agency released the latest gender pay gap data, a few days later, data was released in Sydney about Western Sydney. So I'm a Sydney girl, and Western Sydney is a part of New South Wales that is largely migrant communities from non-European migrant backgrounds. And the data showed a bigger gender pay gap in Western Sydney than other parts of New South Wales. So the data is being collected. We just need to disaggregate and make it visible. And I think that was a really important conversation to have, to bring an intersectional lens to how we talk about gender pay gaps. The second thing I'd say is we're not going to bring that lens or require it or call for it unless you diversify who's at the table. It's very hard to show a correlation between, for example, and Tanja and I were talking about this, women parliamentarians and the laws that are enacted or the bills that are presented when there's more women on the parliamentarians. But there is data that shows a correlation. It seems so obvious and natural that sometimes it takes experiencing disadvantage to be able to call it out. And I'm from a sector, the academic sector, we are so not diverse. I can sit in rooms even where there's more women in the table, largely white women at the table. So unless we diversify who's having these conversations, who's calling out, have you disaggregated by race, sexuality, socioeconomic class, linguistic diversity, we won't be collecting that data. And even when we have it, we won't be publishing it and analysing it to talk about what it means. So it's also a question of diversity of voices in these spaces too.
And I would say from the policy development perspective, the data is important. Until you can show that there is a case to say, this is a problem, it needs to be fixed, then you're not going to get people to focus on it. So we need to have people openly openly declaring their status in the data. And I know I did something at our university, and the number of people who identified as non-binary was so small I couldn't do anything with it.
And can I just say from that point of view that data isn't neutral, right? And people don't want to often disclose certain characteristics that they have that may not be visible if they don't feel safe. And so you will then get underreporting, and then you will then get data that's not worth the paper it's written on. And so it isn't an easy thing to say to a GEA, go out and disaggregate all of your data by a range of characteristics if the collection of those characteristics is not safe for people. So I'm thinking, sexuality, trans status, some disabilities, and even race. Some people, would prefer not to bring it to code that way, right?
But this is why the most important part of the work that we do is recognising that it is incremental and beautifully incremental, and that we do need to work intergenerationally to achieve the change, because it's not going to all happen tomorrow.
Yes.
But each layer is building to create the change that we envisage.
I agree, and it just does show, doesn't it, that you've got to go upstream, upstream, upstream. As we started the conversation, you can't just look at superannuation outcomes. You've got to go upstream, go upstream, go upstream until the way we educate our children, for example, or the way we build organisations and whether people feel safe to disclose various characteristics. So everything becomes more complex when you put a gender spectacle on, but it becomes much more interesting, and you get better outcomes as a society, as an organisation, and as a planet. So I think this is why I think process is really important, even though it's dry. It's super exciting for me, and I think for the panel. And so thank you all for your contributions, and I'm sure we'll continue to have the conversation over a drink fairly shortly. Thank you.
Thanks, Sally.
Thank you all.
Thank you so much to that panel. It was so interesting. I don't think policy is dry. But I also wanted to just reflect that there's a feminist adage that says, like, the personal is political, but also policy has to be personal for it to work as well.